Hey podcast listeners, Fawaz Al-Mufti here from Westchester Medical Center, New York Medical College, and I'm your host on the Neurocritical Care Society podcast. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and desperation is never as acute as when lives are at stake. The COVID-19 pandemic imposed a new reality with unprecedented challenges to global healthcare systems, ranging from equipment shortages, ICU bed capacity deficits, to healthcare personnel being stretched extremely thin. A major emerging concern in low-resource environments is whether monitoring intensity of acute ischemic stroke patients undergoing treatment with intravenous thrombolysis can safely be reduced, allowing for potential cost-effective resource utilization, more rapid ICU turnover, and ICU monitoring and becoming more available to others. Today you'll hear from Dr. Lauren Koffman from Temple University as she discusses with Dr. Victor Urrutia and Dr. Roland Faigle the recent article entitled Low-Intensity Monitoring After Stroke Thrombolysis During the COVID-19 Pandemic. I hope you enjoy this episode.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Neurocritical Care Society podcast series. Today, I would like to welcome Dr. Victor Urrutia, an associate professor of neurology at Johns Hopkins and the director of the Johns Hopkins Hospital Comprehensive Stroke Center, and Dr. Roland Faigle, an assistant professor of neurology at Johns Hopkins. Today, there's a couple papers we'll be discussing. There was recently a Viewpoint paper published in Neurocritical Care entitled Low Intensity Monitoring After Stroke Thrombolysis During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And that paper is really going to be setting forth their viewpoint based on an initial trial, which was published in the Neurohospitalist in May 2019, titled Safety Trial of Low Intensity Monitoring After Thrombolysis, Optimal Post-TPA, IV Monitoring, and Ischemic Stroke, otherwise known as Optimus. So welcome. Thank you guys for joining us. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for inviting us.
Hey, Lauren. Doing well.
So I think we could start off just by going through the background of when your initial paper was published. It was pre-pandemic, but then the Viewpoint came out kind of amidst the pandemic, and I think it brought forth a lot of good rationale for why we might want to move towards this protocol for monitoring post-TPA patients. Can you just kind of talk about the rationale a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So again, thanks for having us, Lauren. Optimist and the work that led up to is really something that Victor and I have been working on for quite a number of years, going way back before the pandemic. And I really view this as an attempt to deliver personalized medicine and value-based care in stroke. But you're absolutely right. The pandemic has highlighted the need for resource-appropriate care. For a long time, I think critical care utilization wasn't really something that was all that much on the forefront of people's minds. But here we are, April 2021. COVID cases are still going up in some places. So I think it's more important now than ever. But what I love about Optimist really is the simplicity of the idea. It's really based on a very simple and straightforward question, and that is there a subpopulation of post-TPA patients that can be safely monitored in a low-intensity environment? As you know, those patients undergo fairly frequent vital sign checks and neurological assessments. It's the usual every 15 minutes for the first 2 hours, and every 30 minutes for the next 6, and then every 1 hour for up to 24 hours. Now that protocol comes from the NINS trial, right? So back in the 1990s, when the investigators purposefully put in guardrails to sort of guarantee the success of the trial. But here we are 25 years later, and with the cumulative experience of TPA that we've had since then, I think clinicians recognize that this post-TPA patient population is actually quite heterogeneous, and that risk really varies from patient to patient. And just to give an example, let's say you have two patients. One is somebody with an NIH of 4, no cortical signs, normal blood pressure, normal glucose, wide awake. And the other one is somebody with a hemispheric syndrome. NIH is in the high teens, systolics in the 200s, and glucose is all over the place. both of those get TPA, the second one might go to thrombectomy. I mean, do we really think that those two patients have the same risk of complications? And I think the answer is, of course not, right? So why should we monitor and care for them as if they did? And so in Optimist, what we really try to do is hone in on what distinguishes low risk from high risk patients. And what we've learned in studies prior to Optimist is that really three things, right? One, patients with low NIH stroke scales, meaning less than 10, generally do well. Two, patients who don't have any critical care needs by the end of the TPA infusion generally do well. And three, if complications happen, they typically happen fairly early on in the first few hours. So in Optimist, we really try to use this information and establish what I would call a resource appropriate protocol for low risk patients and study this prospectively.
Great. Now, can you just briefly go through
Okay.
how your protocol for Optimus varies from the standard post-TPA protocol?
Lauren, I wanted to add something about the rationale for the paper is that, we had been working on starting the Optimus Main trial before the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit and there were a few publications, especially the AHA emergency guidelines for the pandemic and stroke care, we decided that we needed to put out there the protocol in a more user-friendly way so that people could read about the protocol and implement it, as well as advising people of the existence of the trial and that it was soon to roll out.
Great. So speaking of that, how about we just go through who you recommend as kind of low risk and who could be entered into this protocol and what the protocol actually is and how it varies from the post-TPA monitoring.
Right. So the identification of the low risk patients for the Optimus protocol comes back from work that Roland and I and others did before the Optimus trial in figuring out the risk factors for use or need of critical care services after TPA. And what we found was that there was a correlation with NIH stroke scale. The lower the score, the lower the risk. And we found that the critical point was less than 10. We also looked at what was the probability of developing a critical care need if you didn't have one at the end of the infusion with TPA. And we found that that probability was extremely low. And that's why we took that as the marker. So for the Optimus trial, we took patients that had an NIH stroke scale less than 10 and did not have any critical care requirements. And that meant requirements for treatments that required critical care or observation. So patients that were intubated or any type of mechanical ventilation, either invasive or non-invasive, people that were on pressors or medications to lower the blood pressure, or patients that, because of their mental status, required more observation at the judgment of the clinician, were deemed to be low risk at the end of the infusion. And if they had the NIH stroke scale less than 10, then they would fit.
Great. And then how did the nursing ratio and the monitoring vary from once they were done in the emergency room to then transitioning to the new protocol?
So the monitoring, the nursing ratio in the ICU is either 1:1 or 1:2 nurse-patient ratio. And in the Optimus trial, we put the patients in a unit that was 1:3 nurse-to-patient ratio.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add the frequency of the examinations and vital signs. So, as I said earlier, it's every 15 minutes for the first 2 hours. That's the usual protocol, the standard of care, and that is actually also the same in Optimus. So the Optimus protocol is the same as the standard of care in the first 2 hours, but thereafter it diverges. So the usual protocol, the standard of care, goes then to Q30 minutes, and the Optimus protocol goes to every 2 hours for the next 8 hours, and then every 4 hours thereafter.
Great. So you mentioned that the target in this study was low NIH stroke patients. I know the initial Optimist was, a relatively small group of patients. I believe there's 35 patients total. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was a small sample, but one patient that I think I thought of was someone that had a symptomatic carotid stenosis that would come in with a low NIH stroke scale, but then that's someone that we would worry about and typically monitor in ICU for fluctuating symptoms. So what are your thoughts on that kind of patient and if they would be appropriate for this?
Yeah, so I think that the way we did Optimus and the way we have designed Optimus Main is to be very pragmatic, and it all comes down to whether the provider believes that there's a need for critical care. So in most patients that receive TPA, we won't know necessarily if they have a tight carotid stenosis unless they had a CT angiogram. But if their patient has not demonstrated any blood pressure dependence in the exam and there's no instability, they can be enrolled in Optimus, or they can be put on the Optimus protocol. Because the assumption is that if they are clinically stable, they can be monitored with a lower intensity. And that's what we found in the Optimus study, and that's what we aim to find in the Optimus Main study. I don't know, Roland, if you have another.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate, I mean, the protocol is not meant to put the clinician in any sort of box, right? The clinician is still the clinician. If the clinician feels this patient benefits from ICU care, that's the end of the story. Then the patient goes to the ICU and should not be monitored under Optimist.
Great. So you briefly touched upon some of your results, but you just want to kind of discuss what the main findings were?
Yeah, sure. Basically, like Victor said, we enrolled 35 post-TPA patients that met inclusion criteria, meaning NIH less than 10 at presentation and at the end of the TPA infusion, and no critical care needs at any point up to that point. And then the patient went to our telemetry unit, which is our stroke unit, which is a telemetry unit. And what we found is that median NIH stroke scale of those who were enrolled was 3 with a range of 0 to 9. We had 11% stroke mimics, which is sort of the average of what's sort of reported in general. So 90% of those patients that we had were indeed strokes. We had no serious adverse events. No patient required critical care or required transfer to the ICU. And at 90 days, median NIH stroke scale was 0, and the median modified Rankin was 0 as well.
Great. So I think for our listeners, the takeaway point is that this lower intensity monitoring protocol is definitely safe and feasible. So moving forward and talking about Optimus Main, do you want to just talk about this ongoing project and how people can access it and further information?
Yes, so Optimus Main's aim is to be the definitive trial to demonstrate that the Optimus monitoring protocol is as good or better than the standard monitoring protocol based on functional outcomes. We're also aiming to determine if the cost effectiveness and also the impact in the utilization of healthcare resources. So we're measuring, how does that impact the nursing staff, the nurse staffing ratio and distribution of resources. Now we are the trial is a step wedge cluster randomized trial. So sites are included in one of 3 groups, and those 3 groups are randomized to a different order of institution of the Optimus protocol. So those benchmarks are divided into 4 months groups. So those are the steps. In the first step, all 3 groups are using the standard protocol for 4 months. And then in step 2, group 1 starts using the low intensity monitoring, while the other 2 remain on standard. After 4 more months, so that would be after 8 months of starting the trial, then group 1 and 2 will be on the low intensity monitoring, and the group 3 would be on standard. And then 4 months later, then all of the groups are on low intensity. We have 20 sites that are prepared to be in the trial, and that's what we have in terms of funding in the US. This is also a global trial and it's going to have sites in Australia, in Chile, and there's projected sites also in the UK. We are ready to start the first wave of sites in the US by the end of April. And the best way to support the trial is if you have interest, you can reach out to me or Roland, so we can put you on a waiting list in case a site is not able to continue with the trial, or if we get availability for more sites. Otherwise, what we recommend is that, if you are, especially with the COVID pandemic, and if you're feeling the need for better distribution of resources for post-TPA patients, that you can implement the protocol as it's been implemented at many hospitals in the US, including ours. And the paper in neurocritical care, it's a good resource to help you implement that.
Great. Do you have any kind of practical considerations that people should consider if they do decide that they want to implement this protocol in their own institution?
I think that it all starts with getting everybody on the same page. You need to talk to your stakeholders, the ED, the nursing leadership at the ED, and the intensive care unit, and whatever unit you choose to put the patients in with the low intensity, and also talk to the neurointensivist and the neurology group. Once that's done, then and everybody's in agreement, it helps tremendously to create an order set specifically for these patients, and train the providers that are going to make the decision. As Roland said, it's really up to the provider to decide whether the patient needs critical care, and the criteria that we use for Optimus are guidelines. If you don't think that the patient meets those criteria, then they should be managed in the standard monitoring protocol. But if they do, then they can be managed with the low intensity. And the hospital should create the framework for them to make that decision, and then use an order set to define the monitoring schedule.
Well, congratulations. I think this is a great protocol, and it's been needed now for quite some time. It'll definitely alleviate some resources of ours in the ICU. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or you want people to know about what's going on with the study?
Yeah, I'd like to just add one other point that we used in Optimus and also in Optimus Main, and is that even though the decision to put the patient in the low intensity happens at the beginning, for Optimus, it was at the end of the infusion. For Optimus Main, is 2 hours within 2 hours of the bolus of TPA. Going forward, during the rest of the 24-hour period, we are paying attention to the blood pressure. And for example, if a patient requires IV treatment for blood pressure that is more than 3 times in 1 hour, that patient should be pushed back to the standard protocol as a safety measure. The other safety procedure is that if the patient deteriorates neurologically more than 4 points in the NIH stroke scale, that we recommend also consideration. It's not an automatic, but the patient should be reevaluated to see if they have any critical care needs. In the Optimus trial, the 35 patients that we enrolled, we did not have patients that met those criteria. So it seems that the initial allocation, the initial criteria, did predict pretty well whether or not they were going to develop needs for critical care in 24 hours.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, thank you guys for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
While there exists a legal provision for brain death, institutional protocols for diagnosis are not universal and are often absent, as no specific criteria for diagnosis is mandated. Available in both English and Spanish, the Brain Death Determination course, presented by the Neurocritical Care Society and endorsed by the American Academy of Neurology, aims to standardize the process of brain death diagnosis. This certification course, accredited for 2 hours of continuing education, highlights the necessary steps that must be taken, reviews of various exam methods, discusses proper documentation, outlines appropriate communication, and describes common pitfalls and barriers that may arise during the exam process in order to help clinicians, allowed by their local laws, to perform brain death determination. Visit www.neurocriticalcare.org/braindeath to learn more about the certification and use promo code PODCAST for an extra 10% off the purchase of this course.
Thanks for listening to the NCS Podcast. The NCS Podcast is produced by the Neurocritical Care Society, whose mission is to promote quality patient care, professional collaboration, research, training, education, and advocacy in neurocritical care. Our production staff includes Tariq El-Maghribi, Andrew Barishmet, Leonid Groisman, Atul Kalanuria, Lauren Koffman, Cassie Cronfield, Holly Ledyard, Lindsay Marchetti, Alexander Reynolds, Lucia Rivera-Lara, John Rosenberg, Jason Siegel, Zachary Threkold, Teddy Yoon, and Chris Zammit. Our administrative staff and senior producer is Bronnie Rousseau. Music by Mohan Kadapali from the University of Miami Division of Neurocritical Care. If you like our show and want to learn more about us, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. The NCS Podcast is available on NCS On Demand, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Fawaz Al-Mufti, and thanks for listening.